There is no evidence that you have a chemical imbalance in your brain if you are depressed. So therefore, there's no evidence that that antidepressant you're being offered is going to correct that. They haven't asked that question about what antidepressants might be doing by just messing about with our normal brain chemistry. If you subscribe to this idea that you have a brain chemical imbalance, you actually do worse. You have worse outcomes. The psychiatric profession really seemed to me to just want to shut down the debate. They didn't want people to get an inkling that actually depression has not been proven to be a biological condition.
How many people in our society are on these drugs?
So it's something like 8.7 million people in England who take them.
In England?
In England.
So 1 out of 5 people of the adult population is on antidepressants?
Almost 1 out of 5 are taking antidepressants,
Wow.
which is absolutely staggering, isn't it?
Joanna Moncrieff, welcome to Trigonometry.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. You're one of the people who was instrumental in challenging what is the effective consensus on depression, the idea of it being that it's the product of a chemical imbalance, which is something that was, I think it's fair to say, effectively debunked in the last couple of years. So what is depression and why do we have this false idea of it?
Well, I hope I've debunked that idea, but I think it's actually still quite prevalent. You can still find it on websites and things like that depression is caused by lack of serotonin or whatever. So we've had this idea since the 1990s that depression is caused by an abnormality, an imbalance of brain chemicals. Before that, people used to think of depression as a reaction to bad circumstances, unemployment, divorce, child abuse, childhood trauma. And they saw it as an understandable reaction. Of course, there would be variations between different people. Some people would react more strongly to, being made redundant than others. But that fundamentally, it was an understandable human reaction. And then in the 1990s, the pharmaceutical industry released their new range of antidepressant drugs. They wanted to persuade people to take these drugs rather than the old benzodiazepines, which were prescribed for anxiety and which had got this really bad reputation because they caused quite severe dependency problems. And so to distinguish these new antidepressants from the old benzodiazepines, they persuaded people, they put out this idea basically that depression is a medical disorder that is caused by an abnormality in the brain, specifically a deficiency of serotonin, which their new drugs happen to be able to put right. So that's where the idea comes from, this idea that, depression is this medical condition, but it was superimposed onto people's, underlying sort of intuition about what depression was, which was quite different.
And the sort of undercurrent on what you're saying is this was a for-profit motivation that caused this to happen.
Yes. I mean, that idea that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance, an abnormality or deficiency of brain neurotransmitters was around. It was first proposed by psychiatrists and researchers working in the 1960s, again in the context of developing drugs for emotional problems. But it wasn't sort of widely accepted, certainly among the general public. And so it was the 1990s when the pharmaceutical industry got involved and conducted these very thorough promotional campaigns that really spread this idea. And yes, of course, they did it in order to sell more drugs.
And what does the evidence show about this? Is there any evidence to support the chemical imbalance theory? And if there isn't, what is the evidence telling us about what depression is and where it comes from?
So I did a big review of the evidence, which was published in 2022. And I wrote my book because of the reaction we got to publishing that paper, the astonishment of lots of members of the public and the media that actually there wasn't good evidence for this theory, and pushback from the psychiatric profession itself. And what we did was we got together all the evidence from different areas of research that have tried to look at whether there are links between serotonin and depression. Now, there are thousands of studies, And so what we did was we got together reviews of the studies in all the different areas. Now, some of those studies find evidence of a link between serotonin and depression, show that serotonin is a bit lower in people with depression compared to people without depression. Some of the studies don't find any difference, and some of the studies show that serotonin is a bit higher in people with depression compared to people without. So overall, when you put all the results together, there's no consistent evidence of an abnormality either way.
And we're talking about the drugs and the medication. I presume we're talking about what is known as SSRIs. So if you could explain what they are and how they work or how they're meant to work and what the truth is.
Yeah. So SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And they were a range of drugs that started to be introduced in the 1990s, or actually late 1980s. The first one was Prozac, and the generic name is fluoxetine, and they've been the most widely used antidepressants since then. Although some sort of similar drugs have been introduced over the last 20 years. Now, SSRIs work by inhibiting the transporter protein that takes serotonin out of the gap between the nerve cells where it has its action, where it transports the electrical signal from one nerve cell to another. So the SSRI drugs inhibit the protein that takes the serotonin out of that space. And therefore the theory is that the serotonin will stay in that space for longer and therefore its activity will be enhanced. That's the theory. We don't really understand what they're actually doing in practice. They probably are having, enhanced serotonin activity temporarily. But actually some of the evidence that we looked at in our review, and this was a surprise, it wasn't something that we set out expecting at all, but some of the evidence we came across suggested that people who are on long-term antidepressants actually may have lower serotonin activity rather than higher activity. But I think at this point it's probably important to clarify that the evidence that serotonin has any impact on mood is very, very slim. It's basically the evidence that we looked at that tests whether serotonin levels are different in people with depression or without depression. And there've been experiments looking at whether serotonin is involved in people's cognitive functioning as well, and animal studies as well, looking at that sort of thing. That has not found consistent findings. There's also research looking at whether serotonin is involved in sleep and appetite. Again, there are no really consistent findings coming out of that body of research. The only area of our functioning where it seems that there's fairly consistent evidence that serotonin has an effect is sexual functioning, and it's bad for it. The more serotonin you have, the less likely you are to want sex or for your sexual organs and everything to work properly.
And that's something that I really wanted to talk about, because we don't talk enough about the side effects of these types of medication. And you look at the stats of the amount of people who are on them, particularly in the US and the UK and in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. One word to describe it is frightening, really.
Yeah.
Can you give us those numbers, Joanna? How many people in our society are on these drugs?
So it's something like 8.7 million people in England who take them.
In England?
In England. And that works out as something between 15 and 17% of the adult population.
So 1 out of 5 people of the adult population is on antidepressants.
Almost 1 out of 5 are taking antidepressants, which is absolutely staggering, isn't it? And, if they were just sugar pills, I think there would still be some problems, but obviously not sort of major physical problems. But they're not just, they're not inert. They are drugs. They do something. It's not clear that they do anything much to your mood, but they do, as we've said, have this impact on sexual functioning, because we know that, because they are doing something to the serotonin system. And we know that serotonin is involved in our sex lives.
You say they don't do anything for your mood. My understanding, look, I've never taken antidepressants, so I don't know, but even if they don't address the chemical imbalance, I've always kind of thought, well, if you give someone drugs, they're probably going to feel better for a while just because they're on drugs. It's like if I have a glass of wine tonight, I'm going to feel a little bit more relaxed or what. Are they not having any effect like that?
So that's a really good point. And I've been writing about this for a long time. So what you've described, the idea that a drug will have some sort of impact on how you're feeling, is what I've called the drug-centered model of drug action. So that's one way of understanding how drugs might affect our moods and our feelings. And that contrasts with the mainstream view that what these drugs are doing is targeting some underlying abnormality. So your idea that drugs that enter the brain, are going to change our normal feeling states is correct. If we think of something like alcohol, if you can be feeling very depressed, go out and have a shed load to drink, and temporarily you might well feel better again. Obviously, it's not solving anything.
In the moment.
Except in the moment. Yeah. So antidepressants, at least probably most classes of antidepressants, have some emotional numbing effect. We know that because of lots of people describing that. I think it's, we've probably come across people who are taking antidepressants and describe how, they can't cry and they don't feel sort of joy or excitement anymore. They might not feel as intensely sad as they were, but everything's, a bit flat. And so antidepressants have that effect. But whether that effect is actually beneficial or not is questionable. And I say that because the trials of antidepressants that have compared them with placebos, i.e. inactive dummy tablets, really don't show very much difference, even despite that emotional numbing effect. The difference between taking an antidepressant and a placebo in these trials is really small. It's 2 points on a typical 52-point depression rating scale.
So it numbs your feeling a little bit, which is not super impactful.
Yeah.
So come back with me then to the question of, well, if depression is not a chemical imbalance, and in fact, even if there were different levels of serotonin, it's like kind of like saying, well, people who are depressed don't smile as much, therefore smiling is an antidepressant, which, I don't know if there's a lot of evidence for that. But do we know what actually does cause depression?
So the trouble with that question is it sort of presupposes that depression is a thing like lung cancer and we can target a particular cause. And I would suggest that that's the wrong way to think about it. I think depression is a personal state. It's a type of emotion, a type of feeling. And our feelings...
Persistent sadness? Or?
So yes, persistent sadness, loss of interest, loss of motivation, social withdrawal. These are all the common features that we recognise that are quite common, and we may have experienced ourselves or seen in other people around us. And by and large, those reactions and feelings are caused by things that are happening in our lives. They are an understandable reaction to events like, relationship difficulties or loss or change or struggling at work, all those sorts of things. So, and the causes will be different in each person. The reason I don't like this way that we talk about depression as if it is the same as having, cancer, is that it implies that it's the same thing in every person, and therefore we can treat each person with depression in the same way. And of course, that's what we do. We give them, antidepressants and cognitive behavioural therapy, which may be useful for some people. I'm not doubting that, but I think we ought to see depression as, a reaction of an individual, and then the next logical step is to ask, well, why has this individual got into this state at this particular time? What's going on in their lives, and what sort of help do they need? And then you realise that each individual who has depression is going to need different sort of help and support.
That makes sense. I as always, I'm racking my brain for counter arguments just to stress test what you're saying. A couple of things that I think where you might say, well, hold on, isn't this an imbalance or some kind of almost medical thing, or at least chemical thing, is something like postnatal depression, where we know it's quite a common thing when actually something genuinely quite wonderful has happened, right? A woman gives birth, has a child, and then she is depressed. Is that different to, or is, well, what's your take on that?
Well, the first thing to say is, one of the arguments that was made when we published our paper on serotonin and depression was that there are lots of different types of depression. So, you can't say that there's no biological cause of depression. I would change that round and say, well, there isn't any evidence of a biological cause in any sort of subtype of depression. That may be because people haven't done enough research into the different subtypes. But as it is at the moment, we can't say that postnatal depression is different, that we've found some sort of biological cause for that. And I would say that actually, for most people, postnatal depression, although it seems a bit counterintuitive, is often a response to a major change in one's circumstances. Having a baby, having major responsibility at a time when, yes, one's hormones are flying around and, probably not completely stabilized as well. So, but I don't think it's necessarily completely different from other cases.
Well, the hormones thing is kind of my point, because I take your point about it's a major change, but if you put £10 million in my bank account, that is a major change. I'm very unlikely to develop post-millionaire depression or whatever you might call it. Do you see what I mean? So that's one. And the other one I was going to ask you is, what about, is there such a thing? Because I guess I've always been very sympathetic to the argument you're making as someone who was, I don't even like to say I had depression. I think it makes it sound like you had a thing. Yeah. I definitely was depressed at one point in my life, but it was a reaction to the circumstances and also partly to my own behavior, right? I know how to become depressed. If I stay indoors, don't exercise, don't eat well, drink alcohol, don't talk to human beings for a couple of weeks, I guarantee you I'm going to be depressed at the end of that, right? But the counter argument that people have always wheeled out was, but you don't have clinical depression. Clinical depression is a totally different thing. Is there such a thing as clinical depression? The news doesn't just tell you what's happening. It often tells you what to think is happening. And these days, the biggest red flag isn't what's said, it's what gets left out. That's why I use Ground News. It's the only app that compares how the same story is covered across the political spectrum and show you what whole audiences are not being told. The blind spot feed is one of my favorite features. Every day, it flags upwards of 20 stories that are being ignored either by the left or the right. Follow along at ground.news/trigonometry. Like this, a new study from UC San Diego found that climate change cost almost twice as much as we thought because earlier estimates left out damage to the oceans. That's a pretty big update, and yet no coverage. Literally zero came from right-leaning outlets. Or this, a recent Gallup poll found trust in the media has hit a record low, with just 28% of Americans saying they trust newspapers, radio, and TV to report the news accurately and fairly. That's a staggering result, but if you only read left-leaning news, you likely never saw it at all. Go to ground.news/trigonometry to get 40% off their Unlimited Advantage plan, the same one we use, and stop being managed by the media.
So again, there's no evidence that there is a specific subgroup of people with depression who have something that is biological and medical and different from the sort of depression that we might all experience. We've been told for many, many years now, haven't we, that there is, a different thing called clinical depression, which is a proper medical condition. So, most people are signed up to that. If you're told something, enough times, you think it must be true, especially if you're told by experts. But actually, there's no evidence. All these studies on serotonin and depression were done with people with, clinical depression. They'd had depression diagnosed by their doctors, which is all that we really mean by clinical depression. And we're still not finding evidence for, biological abnormalities in them. But also, I think it's important to realise that there's no sort of secret ingredient to the diagnosis of depression. Someone who's feeling unhappy and struggling with life goes to their doctor, says, I'm unhappy and I'm struggling. And the doctor, on the day makes a judgment about whether or not they think they should be treated with antidepressants or not. Should we consider this to be a sort of medical case that we're going to give medical treatment to? And that, that decision it isn't made by, rigidly following some very precise
there's no antibody in the bloodstream
and
that you can...
No, and there's certainly no objective physical tests that can tell the doctor. And so it depends a lot on the doctor you see, whether they've seen a pharmaceutical industry rep that lunchtime before they saw you, their sort of outlook on life, how they understand emotions, the training they've had, and it depends on how the individual patient presents as well. So some people, come to their doctor convinced that they have a medical problem, that they need, an antidepressant or some sort of chemical solution. And some people come, much more uncertain, not really knowing what the right, what the right way to interpret this is. And that will influence whether the doctor says, you have clinical depression or not as well.
I'm putting myself in the shoes of a GP who's got this patient coming to them. They say they're depressed because, let's say, a bereavement. Their child has died. I feel that I have to do something. I can't send this person away. I can say, oh, you're going to get counselling or some type of CBT on the NHS, but the waiting list is 18 months. It's probably even longer than that. What am I going to do? I'm just going to let this person go? No, I need to be seen to be doing something, because if they do something extreme, then it's going to come back to me. So in order to cover myself and to be seen to be doing something, I'm going to prescribe antidepressants. Isn't that how it would work?
I think it absolutely does work like that. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we have, such huge rates of prescribing. And, yes, understandably, GPs want to feel, want to be able to offer people something. Waits for therapy were very long, or there was no therapy available at all for many decades here. We do now, though, have a national therapy service which has waiting lists of a few weeks, so that's not quite so bad. But I think that's a really good point. I think and I think one of the problems is that because we've medicalised depression, because we've told people to go and see their doctors, then it just gets confirmed, because if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, don't you? And what do doctors have? They have a prescription pad and a diagnostic book. So they tell you, yes, you've got this condition and this is the treatment, this drug.
Absolutely. And to me, one of the great tragedies about when we talk about the depression or any type of mental health condition is because we don't know a lot about it, if we're being honest. Because that does seem to be the central theme of the conversation, is like, look, we don't actually know. So a lot of the time, the treatment or the procedures are actually do more harm than good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the main messages I would like to get across to people. There is no evidence that you have a chemical imbalance in your brain if you are depressed. So therefore, there's no evidence that antidepressant you're being offered is going to correct that. But we do know that antidepressants are, real drugs that enter the brain and change the normal state of our brain chemistry. And that, and that can have harmful consequences. That's not necessarily a harmless thing to do. We should be worried about messing about with our brain chemistry. And we haven't, because the psychiatric profession and all the psychiatric research establishment has been so focused on this wrong idea that antidepressants target some underlying imbalance or some other sort of underlying dysfunction of the brain. They haven't asked that question about what antidepressants might be doing by just messing about with our normal brain chemistry. What are the consequences if you take these drugs for months and years at a time, as many people do? There's really not very good research on that. There are, as we mentioned earlier, some suggestions coming out that actually these drugs can be very damaging to people's sexual functioning, people's emotional life, that they can cause severe withdrawal symptoms. But all these things have actually come out because people have been reporting them, not because people were doing, had set up systematic research studies to investigate the consequences of use in the first place.
And to me, it derives as well from the fact that if we're being honest, we don't really understand the brain. I mean, you look at the other organs and you go, well, we understand the kidney pretty well, the heart. I mean, the heart is basically a muscle, or the liver, whatever else. But even if you talk to one of the most eminent neurologists of the day and you ask them a question about the brain, I'm sure a lot of them would go, look, we don't know about X, we don't know about Y, we don't know about Z. So in absence of all this knowledge, we're just thinking of these techniques of how to help people.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got a wrong impression that we know more about the brain than we do. And that's partly because of the way that a lot of neuroscience findings are presented and reported. So we're always seeing articles, aren't we? Like, you can boost your dopamine by doing this. And, if you have more dopamine, you'll be more active or a better athlete or something like that. And if you lack serotonin, then you're, not only just not as happy, but socially dysfunctional or something like that. So these headlines get put out there all the time. So people have the impression that we know more about the brain than we do. And I would agree, we don't know very much about it. For example, we've identified a lot of the different chemicals that are active in the brain, but we understand very little about what each of them do.
And why is that?
It's partly because they all interact. So actually isolating the effect of one is difficult. It's also because sticking chemicals into human brains is a very difficult thing to do. So, there's some research done on animals, but not very much research on human beings that directly manipulates brain chemicals for obvious reasons.
Because there's this fascinating, when people talk about mental health, they conflate it with mental illness. So we talk about depression and schizophrenia as if they're under the same umbrella, when, as anybody knows, and I have people in my family who have suffered from schizophrenia, it is a very, very different condition to depression.
I think it's a very different condition, but there's not very good evidence for any biological basis for schizophrenia either.
Really?
So it's still a mental illness in the sense that it's an illness or condition that we diagnose or identify on the basis of how people behave.
I guess what Francis is getting at, I think, is more that depression is something that we probably all experience at one point of our lives to a lesser or greater degree. Schizophrenia is a whole different story.
Yeah, which I completely agree with. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think depression is something understandable and familiar, and schizophrenia is quite a radically different state from our ordinary everyday lives.
And I guess the other part of it, and this is, it's difficult to talk about because you never want to talk about people who have a particular problem from a kind of responsibility point of view, because it sort of sounds like blame a lot of the time. But I guess you can probably speak about yourself. As I said earlier, like, I know how to give myself or put myself in the state of being depressed. I also have discovered how to get myself out of that state, right? And I think I would imagine, obviously big pharma, people always want to make money from helping people fix their problems. But let's be honest, a lot of people, all of us, want an easy fix for things. And if someone comes along and gives you a tablet, instead of saying, okay, well, you've got this problem, okay, here's what you do. You exercise 4 times a week. You don't eat any sugar. You don't eat any other crap. You make sure you speak to your family every day. You do this, you do that.
That'll give you depression.
Whatever. I mean, that probably will. You know what I mean? There's a whole, you have to change your whole lifestyle, or we can just give you this tablet. Yeah, and a lot of people would rather just take the tablet.
Yeah. The problem is that we know that if you subscribe to this idea that you have a brain chemical imbalance, you actually do worse. You have worse outcomes, and you think that you can't do anything about your condition, and you are more likely to believe that you will never recover.
Yeah, it feels like cancer.
Yeah.
Right? So, it feels like you got cancer.
So I think what happens when someone is prescribed an antidepressant, often they will initially get some sort of psychological benefit, some positive placebo effect, because they think, great, at last someone's helping me, I've got an explanation, the drug's going to work. So often people will start to feel a bit better. But because actually the drugs are not a long-term solution, probably not really having much impact on your mood, other than slightly numbing you, which is probably not helpful. in the long run, they don't work. And when people start to realize, actually, I don't really feel better, then they can be in an even worse state, because then they think, not only do I have this, horrible medical condition that, I need to take a drug to sort out, but I'm not even responsive to this drug. I'm treatment resistant. The treatment hasn't worked. I've got to go back and get the next line of treatment, and then that might not work. So actually people can end up in a, really sort of negative and pessimistic state. So although it feels like it might be a nice, easy solution and beneficial in the long run, I think it's not.
And Joanna, we have had on the show on all sorts of different subjects, and culture and politics and comedy and music and whatever, lots of people who have challenged the consensus in their field. Doesn't usually go that well. People don't tend to take on new ideas that easily. How have you found the response to bringing these ideas forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's been a lot of pushback from the psychiatric profession. And from members, some from members of the public and some from the media. I think members of the public sort of went two ways when we published that paper, which is part of what I write about in the book. Some people said, "Oh my goodness, thank you for enlightening me. Now I realize, I shouldn't be taking this medication that I was given and has never done me any good anyway." And then other people, people who'd really changed their whole feelings about themselves, changed their self-beliefs, come to see themselves as someone who had this brain condition and, was going to need this long-term treatment, and found having that idea of themselves challenged, difficult, found that difficult to be challenged about that idea. Some of them pushed back and said, it's irresponsible to publish this, you're going to make people feel awful. Mm. So we had those sort of responses. The psychiatric profession really seemed to me to just want to shut down the debate. They didn't want people to get an inkling that actually depression has not been proven to be a biological condition. I think they wanted people to go along under that impression, which is why no one has challenged this idea of the chemical imbalance theory earlier, because actually it's been known for a long time that the evidence didn't add up. I mean, although I got all the evidence together in a systematic way in this paper in 2022, a lot of people said when I published it, "Oh, we knew all that. Of course we knew there wasn't evidence for a chemical imbalance. Of course we knew there wasn't evidence for the serotonin theory of depression." And I think the reason that no one had highlighted that before is because actually it suited the profession for the public to go on believing that we had discovered the biological origins of depression, so that they would go on subscribing to this medical view and taking the antidepressants. And in fact, they, these psychiatrists who sort of challenged the paper in that way often suggested that, well, okay, you haven't found a serotonin imbalance, but maybe it could be inflammation. There's lots of other theories. It could be inflammation, it could be problems with neuroplasticity, it could be other neurotransmitters. The problem is that none of those are all theories about possible biological causes of depression, but none of them have been proven either. And there's much less research in those areas than there is on serotonin and depression. So, yes, there was lots of pushback, but as I started with, there are still lots of public information sites that tell people that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. But I think there are fewer now. I know that, for example, the Australian and New Zealand Royal College of Psychiatrists took down their blurb that told people that depression was due to a chemical imbalance. And I think some other sites have been changed as well.
So if we don't know exactly what causes people to feel persistently sad, let's call it that, how much do we know about ways of consistently overcoming that state or getting out of that state? So we know that the vast majority of people will recover at some point spontaneously. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important point to state, because we've sort of created the idea, and in fact the
president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, was on the radio the other day saying people don't get better from mental illness on their own. Well, people do get better from depression on their own. Whether you call it a mental illness or not is another matter, but it certainly is classified as mental illness. So it's important to know that people can get better on their own. And then how people get better depends on the reasons why they have become depressed, the particular individual causes in their situation. So, some people might need relationship counselling to sort out relationship difficulties. Some people might need support at work. Some people will benefit from having general psychological therapy, talking therapy, in order to work out why they're feeling depressed, because we don't all obviously know. And even if we know, we may not have any clear idea about how we can change those things that have made us depressed. So I think therapy can help with that. And I think therapy can also help with processing childhood trauma, major events. It can help people to build up self-esteem, which is often part of the problem as well. So I think therapy can be helpful, but I don't think it's necessarily a panacea or something that everyone, has to have. And then there are general things that improve people's mood or well-being on a day-to-day basis, like exercise, like eating well, like social interaction, like having meaning and purpose. I think that's really important. And I think that is one of the major things that we struggle with in modern life, now that we don't have meaning and purpose given to us in the form of a religion. Obviously, some people still subscribe, but many people don't subscribe to a religious faith. And therefore we have to create our own, and that's not always easy.
Spring is a wonderful time of year, right up until you're standing on a job site at 7 in the morning, wondering why your trousers are already soaked through and your pocket is 6 inches from where you expected it to be. True Work makes workwear that is actually built around those conditions. The T2 work pant has 4-way stretch so you can bend, kneel and climb without the fabric fighting you. A water-resistant finish so a shower doesn't immediately ruin your morning. And 9 pockets positioned where trade professionals said they actually needed them, not where someone guessed. It will not surprise you to learn that I am not exactly a man who works with his hands. The closest I get is watching someone else fix my boiler, so I'll let the reviewers handle this. Matthew Hobbs says he has never been able to find such comfortable, durable, and great-fitting work pants until now. And CJR wrote, they fit right the moment I tried them on. True Work workwear has been tested over 10 years by people working in real conditions out on the tools. Upgrade to the T2 work pant and stay comfortable no matter what the day brings. Get 15% off your first order at truework.com with code TRIG. That's TRUEWERK.com, code TRIG. True Work, built like it matters, because it does. Do you think also the part of the problem is, Joanna, that mental illness and mental health have now become an identity? You see it with people in their bios on Twitter, on social media, say ADHD, bipolar, etc. If that's your identity, you're not going to want to get better, are you?
Yeah, I think this is a big problem. And I think that's absolutely right, that it can it can give people the impression that they'll never get better. And also it limits people. That's what worries me about this, having a mental health identity, is that you might think, well, because I've got this thing, this mental health problem, I can't do that sort of job. I can't do that activity. I'm never going to be able to have a relationship, maybe, so, and again, it's sort of this, I think people who adopt a mental health identity have different ideas about what it really means. Mm-hmm. And some people, I think, are just saying, I'm a bit different from other people. This is who I am. Some people, I think, have bought into the idea that they have some, problem with their brain. And if you're one of those who's just saying, I'm a bit different, well, maybe that's okay. But again, I sort of feel that it still might be limiting to feel that, you have this difference that's a sort of intrinsic part of you. But people who've really bought into the full idea they've got a problem with their brain, well, first of all, there isn't evidence that that's true. So they're buying into a mistaken idea, and that's very limiting. If you're thinking of yourself as someone who is flawed, who has an abnormal brain, that a broken brain, as some people refer to it, then obviously you will limit yourself, and you will possibly not lead as fulfilling life as you could otherwise have led.
And also as well, and this is, by the way, there's no judgment on my behalf, because this is not an identity, but there are times where I have embraced this particular type of viewpoint, which is that of being a victim. Life gets, things happen to me, and therefore, I'm a victim of life, etc. How much of this is people essentially assuming the mantle of being the victim? And as a result of that, they don't have to take full responsibility. In the same way that, people go, well, I have ADHD, which means I have outbursts at times, which means I can go around and tell you what I think of you, which is unfortunately how some people behave.
So let me tell you about a little project I did with a student a few years ago. We looked at people's, at the blogs of people who identified themselves as being depressed and having significant problems with depression. And we analysed how people seemed to understand their depression, but also what they did about it. And what was very interesting is that most of the people in these blogs were fully signed up to this medical idea that they had something wrong with their brain. And they were signed up because this made them feel better about themselves. This excused them from feelings of shame, from feelings that they'd let other people down, or weren't, pulling their weight in their family or workplace or whatever. But what was very interesting is that when you saw how they wrote about how they'd overcome depression, they all said that they had to take active steps themselves in order to change their lives, in order to overcome this problem. So none of them were saying that we just took the drug and it fixed our chemical imbalance and everything was fine. They were all saying we had to examine our lives, we had to understand why we felt as we did, and we had to do something about it. We realised we had to change something. And that process of change had often involved a process of personal growth and development, and many of them felt that they'd become fuller and better people as a result of that self-examination process that they'd gone through. So I think that shows that it is important for people to have agency, to examine what this means, what they're feeling is a response to, what's gone wrong for them, and what can they do to change it. But it also shows, as you say, how people, do feel ashamed and embarrassed about letting people down. And yes, that it's nice to have a sort of peg to hang those feelings on, so that you don't have to, keep battering yourself about them.
Absolutely, because look, human beings are human beings. And if you're going to give someone an excuse, they're going to invariably take that excuse. They just will, because that's how we are. I think sometimes, and if we give people the idea that they can overcome something and that they have agency, I really do think that's a more effective solution than to tell people that they're going to be these victims of this awful condition.
Yeah, I do. And I agree with you. And that's why I think it's so important that people know that we don't have, that this idea that depression is a chemical imbalance is not established, is not proven, because people who have this idea that, they have this brain problem do, and there's research showing this, do feel that there's not much they can therefore do about it. And so they sit back and they're relying on the pill that you give them to make them feel better. And, that's not going to work because the pills aren't very effective anyway. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to disabuse people of this idea.
And because we have to tackle this, because there's going to be a pretty large swathe of people who are watching this or interview or listening to it going, how much of this is the drug companies' involvement, vested interest, profits, etc.?
Well, it certainly all got kicked off by that, I would say. So, as I said, the idea that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance wasn't initially dreamt up by them. The people who sort of came up with these theories were psychiatrists and researchers back in the 60s. But it was the drug companies that really grabbed it and ran with it in the 1990s when they were trying to promote the SSRIs and the subsequent antidepressants that have come onto the market. And they flooded the medical airwaves with this idea. And then when, the internet really got going and people got access to the internet, they flooded the internet with this idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. I would say that they are very much responsible for having established this idea in the popular psyche. The drug companies are not that interested in antidepressants anymore. There are one or two coming online, but most of them are now off patent, so they're not really being heavily promoted. Most of the antidepressants that we use now, they're not. It's not necessarily down to drug company activity that this idea is being maintained, but I think they had established it so well, and they'd had help. They'd had help from medical institutions that ran public information campaigns, often with backing from the pharmaceutical industry, to disseminate this idea, to do disease awareness campaigns, to tell people basically, if you're feeling a bit down, go and see your GP. This could be a medical problem. So they got lots of help from the medical profession, and the medical profession and some medical sites anyway are still putting this idea forward. But definitely it was the pharmaceutical industry that really popularized it on a wide scale.
Well, coming back to your conversation you were having about, people feeling like they're victims, the people I feel really, really sorry for, I think most of all, is the parents of children who've been told this. And I imagine that's a very difficult situation, because if your child believes this medical theory and they have all the weight of expertise behind it, and you're there kind of going, well, why don't you go for a walk and see your friends more and do this and do that? You are in a very difficult position where you're like the dinosaur who doesn't get it, while your child is basically being drugged for a problem that in a way that's not actually being solved.
Yeah, I come across a few accounts from parents where that's happened, where their teenage or young adult child has gone off and got a diagnosis, and they feel that actually this is an understandable situation and there could be other ways of dealing with it, and worry understandably about that person getting started on an antidepressant, but potentially entering into a cascade of medical treatments, which people do because the drugs aren't effective. I agree.
There was one other thing I wanted to ask you in relation to the side effects of SSRIs. I don't know if this is true, but I do remember reading in the wake of a number of very highly publicized mass shootings in the US that there was at least a correlation between SSRI use and mass acts of violence of that kind. Do we know anything about that scientifically?
So there is quite a bit of research that shows a correlation, as you say, between acts of violence and also suicidal behaviour and taking antidepressants. Maybe the correlation between suicidal behaviour isn't so surprising. It's difficult to disentangle cause and effect. So, of course, people who are suicidal get put on antidepressants, and people who have violent tendencies may well also be diagnosed with depression and put on antidepressants because their behaviour is already problematic. But there is a little bit of research that suggests that antidepressants can occasionally make people suicidal and violent and aggressive, particularly young people. I don't know why it's particularly in young people, but that does seem to be a consistent finding. And these studies that show this are randomized controlled trials. So they are studies that, are comparing the effects of people taking antidepressants and placebo. So they're not, that's factored out the problem of trying to disentangle cause and effect. And some of those studies do suggest that there is a small increase in violent behaviour and in suicidal behaviour in people on antidepressants compared to people taking a placebo.
And Joanna, something that piqued my interest when we were talking earlier was when you were explaining about the drug companies, they're no longer interested in antidepressants. The patent has expired, therefore there's not much money to be made. And there's a little light in my brain went, so what are they interested in now? And what are they seeking to make money from? And then I thought about the explosions in rates of ADHD diagnosis, autism diagnosis. Am I a conspiracy theorist, or is there something else going on?
So you're absolutely right. ADHD is a big development area at the moment. There are lots of, not lots, but there are a few drugs being launched or that were launched a few years ago for ADHD, including ADHD in adults, which has obviously mushroomed in recent years. And there are some new drugs for depression being promoted. For example, esketamine, which is a relative of ketamine, and then the.
But this is my point. If you give people drugs, they're going to feel good for a while.
Absolutely,
do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So it's really going in that direction. There is. It looks like the pharmaceutical industry are producing more and more psychoactive drugs that are directly related to drugs that are used on the recreational drug scene. I wonder whether, this is really conspiratorial, but I wonder whether they've looked at the opioid crisis in the States and thought, well, they got away with it. You know, they got a lot of people, they sold a lot of opiates by telling people that they're not addictive, and they got away with it. And maybe we should, try some drugs a bit like that. So there are opiate-like drugs being developed for the treatment of depression, believe it or not.
What?
Yeah, absolutely. There's S-methadone.
You want to have a good time? There you go.
But
this is what I'm saying. Is like if you can't legalize drugs or make a profit from selling people weed, well, you just call it, something else. You add a little thing in front of it or at the end or whatever, and you just give it to them, and then they have a great time and everybody's happy.
So yeah, I mean, it's not that ludicrous. That is what is happening. I mean, these just to clarify, these opioid drugs are claimed not to have opioid-like effects. But it does look as if they do have some sort of opioid type profile.
The opioids, you think they have an opioid-like effect.
And then, of course, we've got this huge.
Sorry, can I just pause it there just one second? As somebody who's seen the effects in my family of depression and addiction, the last thing that you want to do with somebody who is depressed is give them a highly addictive substance.
Yeah, absolutely. Although antidepressants are dependence forming, but not don't cause sort of misuse in the way that opioids do. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry, this interview is descended, but I just find this so ridiculous. Like the way we talk about this stuff, it's almost like you're not allowed to like put two and two together anymore and go, well, if you're just giving people drugs that people take recreationally,
I know.
They're probably not going to solve anything.
So esketamine is a good example, if I can just talk about this.
Yeah,
so esketamine, which is very closely related to ketamine, essentially has the same effects as ketamine. No one disputes that. And it's been trialled in trials, giving it twice a week to people, in trials just as if it was an antidepressant, with the idea that, people should just, be on this for a few months or, possibly a few years. I'm sure with the anticipation that people will actually go on it for years and years. And, and they do depression measurement scales, and then they do side effect scales, one of the side effects being dissociation, and conclude that, because your depression symptoms come down after you've taken this esketamine, that you've somehow recovered from your depression. I mean, it's completely absurd. The normal psychoactive effects of ketamine are all contained in the little side effect scale, and it's as if these are completely separate. They're the way that they affect your mood and the way that they, cause the dissociation and euphoria.
So basically, a guy
everything.
comes into your office and says, "I'm depressed." You go out and have 10 pints, and then while he's having the 10 pints, you go, "How are you feeling?"
Yeah,
He's like, "Oh, much better, doc."
Yeah, exactly.
And that's basically what you've got.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, not only that, but ketamine and esketamine are both being promoted as rapid onset treatments for suicidal thoughts. So, you come in and you have your infusion of ketamine, and someone measures your, suicidal thoughts ratings, and they've gone down, and therefore this is, thought to be a treatment. I mean, it
sounds like a joke.
It does, doesn't it? It does. But actually, this is happening.
There's a window with hair loss. Most men find out exactly where it is by missing it. Hims offers convenient access to a range of prescription hair loss treatments with ingredients that work, including chews, oral medications, serums and sprays. Doctor-trusted ingredients like finasteride and minoxidil can stop further hair loss and regrow hair in as little as 3 to 6 months. It's all 100% online with personalised treatment plans and no hidden fees. No awkward appointments, no surprise costs. Just real care on your schedule. For simple online access to personalised and affordable hair care for hair loss, ED, weight loss and more, visit hims.com/trigger. That's hims.com/trigger for your free online visit. hims.com/trigger. Featured products include compounded drug products which the FDA does not approve or verify for safety, effectiveness or quality. Prescription required. See website for full details, restrictions and important safety information. Individual results may vary based on studies of topical and oral minoxidil and finasteride. It's deeply irresponsible because if any of you followed the story about Matthew Perry, the Friends actor, he was obviously highly depressed, struggled with addiction for all of his life, used ketamine as a way to overcome his addiction and effectively died of a ketamine overdose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just restricted to him. There was an article in, I think it was The Guardian a couple of years ago that was interesting, which was about how a lot of ketamine clinics were closing down because, there'd been, the market was saturated and too many had opened up essentially. And there were people desperate that their local clinic had closed down and they couldn't go and get their next, treatment. So, basically people had become dependent, probably a mixture of psychological and physical dependence on having their regular ketamine infusions. And then suddenly the whole service shut down and they couldn't get it.
But isn't it interesting, just the language, and I think it's very important to state, Big Pharma, that's done a lot of good. Let's be honest about that. But the names, S-ketamine, you go a ketamine infusion. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're just getting off your nut on ketamine.
Yeah. And the latest thing that's come in is psychedelics. So, psilocybin, psilocybin ecstasy. And again, there are serious trials of these things going on with this idea that they might cure treatment-resistant depression. It's quite interesting. It started out as what's called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So the initial idea, which isn't maybe quite so crazy, is that you had a psychedelic experience, you had a trip with under supervision, and then you processed what you experienced during that trip in some subsequent psychotherapy. And the idea was that maybe the psychedelic experience would give you some insights into why you were depressed or what you might do to improve yourself and your life and your mood, and that was what was helpful. So, I mean, I still think that's a sort of rose-tinted view of what drugs can achieve in people who are, deeply depressed. But there's some logic to it. At least it was acknowledging these are psychoactive substances. You have a psychoactive experience. You have you go into an altered state for a bit. But what's happened is that has sort of morphed into this idea that actually what they're doing is, fixing some brain chemical receptor problem or some chemical imbalance. And that, of course, easily translates into the idea that what you need to do is take them long term, just as people take antidepressants long term. And of course, that's how it's going to go, because it's not a good business model, is it, to have, to set up a clinic where you come in and you have one psychedelic experience, a couple of psychotherapy sessions, and then you're cured. Yeah. Which is what the initial idea was.
Is it, by the way, on the psychedelic point, it's something that we have talked to one or two people on the show who have suggested that it might actually be effective for things like PTSD and other things. Is there any evidence on that that you're aware of?
So there was a trial done on PTSD and ecstasy, I think, and
ecstasy is not psychedelic, is it?
Well, it's a little bit psychedelic. It's a bit psychedelic and a bit amphetamine-like. The results showed some benefit, but the problem with all these trials is, of course, you can't blind people at all. I mean, you can't blind people in an ordinary antidepressant trial very reliably, but you certainly can't blind people if you're giving people ecstasy or psilocybin or something like that, or ketamine.
It's just for people who are not medical experts,
yeah.
You're not poking their eyes out. What you mean when you say you can't blind them is they know they're taking ecstasy.
Yes. Yeah. So you set up this trial where you compare taking ecstasy to taking a placebo tablet, and you give people the placebo with the idea that people won't know whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo. But of course, if you're comparing something like ecstasy with a chalk or sugar tablet, people will know the difference. And it's the same with antidepressants to some extent, although it's probably less immediately obvious. So the problem is that you can't effectively blind, you can't effectively disguise what people are getting. And so there's probably an enhanced placebo effect associated with thinking that you're getting the real active substance. So this trial of ecstasy and PTSD, I think they did find a small effect, but there are concerns that it was basically due to this unblinding effect, due to the fact that people knew what they were getting.
What about psilocybin more specifically? Is there any evidence on that?
So there were a couple of small trials of psilocybin, trying to revive my memory of them. There's one that's compared psilocybin to an antidepressant and didn't find any difference. That was done by a group in this country. There might be another one that's compared it with placebo, I think, and found some immediate difference, but much less difference when you follow people up a bit later, as you would expect if they were actually if what you're picking up is people's drug-induced experience.
There's going to be people listening and watching this who are already thinking to themselves, you know what, I've been on antidepressants for a while. Maybe it's time to get off. What advice would you give? Because I'm sure it wouldn't be just take your antidepressants, throw them in the bin and go cold turkey.
That's a really important question. Thank you for asking me. So the most important thing to say is don't do that. Don't just put them in the bin, particularly if you've been taking them for long periods of time, because they can be associated with quite severe withdrawal symptoms. So people need to come down on them slowly. Now, some people will need to do that very slowly, particularly if they've been on them for years and years, in order to minimize the withdrawal symptoms that they will get. The other thing that's important to say is that withdrawal symptoms include emotional symptoms like anxiety, tearfulness, and changeability of mood, feeling down, feeling sad. They include a lot of emotional symptoms. In the same way that coming off alcohol or heroin, any psychoactive substance, messes up your mood when you're coming off it. So people will experience emotional symptoms when they're coming off their antidepressants. They shouldn't just assume that means they're having a relapse, because I think very commonly that has happened, that people have started to come off, started to feel a bit anxious, a bit more emotional than usual, assume that they're having a relapse and that they need to go back on their medication. And many of those people then think, oh, well, I've just got to take it for life, which is really tragic, because actually probably if they'd known what was happening, A, and B, reduced more slowly, they might well have got off their antidepressants. So people need to be aware that there are withdrawal symptoms. These include emotional symptoms. Also, some people get physical symptoms like dizziness, like feelings of electricity going through the brain, quite typically. And these can be minimized by coming off slowly, and particularly it's particularly important to come off the last bit slowly. So to get down to low doses, then don't just throw it in the bin, keep reducing the dose very slowly. There are guides now to help people with that. The Royal College of Psychiatrists have some good information on their stopping antidepressants, their section of their website, that was written by a colleague of mine who's had personal experience of coming off antidepressants. And he's also co-authored a book called the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines, which gives people lots of information. It's massive and very dense and quite expensive, but it's something that people could potentially recommend their GPs to get if their GPs were uncertain about how to help people, or if people were worried that their GPs were telling them to come off too fast, as I think is probably quite often the case.
So, that's worrying that the GPs don't really know how to get people to come off these drugs, because if they come off too fast, what you're basically saying is that the side effects can be quite severe.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's evidence that some people, probably particularly people who come off too fast, will get into a persistent withdrawal state, or a persistent state whereby they often feel foggy, debilitated, tired. Some people can't get out of bed. People have to stop work or reduce their hours. Can cause all sorts of social problems. And I know more and more about this because, along with colleagues, I've set up a little deprescribing service in the mental health trust that I work in, and we are increasingly referred people who are in these terrible states, having come off antidepressants too fast. So it's really, and I brought that up because I think that not that many GPs and doctors are aware of this problem, are aware that there are these persistent states that people can get into if they come off too fast. It's tragic that we're not aware enough about that, because actually the same problem was shown with benzodiazepines back in the 1980s. It was shown that some people who came off benzodiazepines, again, showed persistent problems, often persistent neurological symptoms and persistent anxiety. So it does seem that some drugs, if you come off them too fast, can really cause a lot of damage.
And you're saying persistent. What does that mean medically?
So good question. It means that the symptoms can go on for months and sometimes for years. Wow. People have reported these sometimes for years. And while we're on that subject, can I just bring up the subject of persistent sexual dysfunction? I think that's also something.
Thank you for looking at me when you said that, Joanna.
No, I just think it's something that's really important, and again, something that's not nearly well recognised enough by the profession as well as by the public. So it's well acknowledged that antidepressants cause sexual dysfunction while you're taking them because they're disrupting the serotonin system. That's not in dispute and affects a lot of people who take them. What has become evident over the last couple of decades, I would say, with increasing reports, is that some people will have persistent problems with their sexual functioning after they stop taking their antidepressants. And not only has this come out from reports of patients, it's evident from animal studies that show that young animals, rats and mice that are treated as adolescents or young adults with antidepressants show persistent problems with their sexual functioning after this drug has been stopped. We don't know how common this problem is. I mean, I hope to goodness that it's rare, but there are increasing reports, and there have been a couple of attempts to try and work out how prevalent it is, one of which suggests it might affect up to around about 10% of people who stop taking antidepressants. And again, we don't know how long the problems might last. It might just be a few months for some people, but there is definitely people who report that it lasts for years. And many people say that it's not just sexual functioning, it's their emotional functioning as well, that they feel generally numbed, emotionally and sexually. So really important for people to be aware of that, and to be aware that their doctors may well not be aware of that.
Joanna, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. Final question is always the same. What's the one thing we're not talking about that we really should be?
Oh gosh. I think we've covered everything that I need to cover. As I've said, my mission is to make sure that people are informed. Maybe I can just sort of finish by saying that I don't have any beef with people taking antidepressants or seeking a diagnosis of depression, as long as people understand what the implications are, and particularly what the effects of antidepressants are, and how little we know about what the long-term consequences might be.
Well, thanks for coming on and sharing that with people. Really valuable. We're going to go to Substack where people are going to ask you their questions now. So head on over to triggerpod.co.uk and we'll see you there. So should teenagers be taking all these medications for ADHD? I worry about taking something during these developing years. Shouldn't they get help but talk about the issues and given problem-solving strategies instead?